Go.
Okay, this is lesson 22, and we are back with Ben. Remember that he was at the meteorite, and he was wondering if he could make a wish on a meteorite because it is just a fallen shooting star. It says, Ben pressed his hand against the meteorite. He loved how solid it was. He placed the suitcase on the ground, rested his cheek on the smooth surface, and closed his eyes. He made another wish. When Ben opened his eyes and looked up, he noticed a mirror on the ceiling reflecting coins on top of Agnito. I don't know how to pronounce whatever that A word is. Amid the silver change, he saw a small piece of folded paper. Before he could reach for it, he was jerked backward away from the meteorite. He turned and found himself facing an angry guard who was gripping his shoulder and obviously yelling at him. Just as Ben was about to apologize, someone darted past behind the guard and Ben tried to shake himself free, but he couldn't. He tried to read the guard's lips. He thought he was asking where Ben's parents were. My parents told me to meet them in the Hall of Ocean Life in 10 minutes. The guard shook his head, said something else, and then looked toward the Hall of Gems and Minerals, where there seemed to be a problem. He said one last thing to Ben before walking away. Carefully, Ben balanced on top of his suitcase, reached up and grabbed the note. He unfolded it. In green ink, it read, "What's inside the box?" Did you think that he was fixing to unfold the note that Rose left 50 years earlier? How long had the note been sitting up there? Ben wondered. He reread it and thought about the museum box in a suitcase. Had he put it back when everything spilled out on the steps? He couldn't remember. He opened the suitcase and dug through his clothes. The box wasn't there. Turning the note over, Ben discovered a little hand-drawn plan of the museum's first floor, also in green ink. Running through the whole thing was a long dotted line that twisted through the hallways and ended like a treasure map with an X. Ben followed it room by room until he came to a narrow corridor, which is a hallway, lined with dioramas he hadn't passed before. The X on the map was in front of the fifth one. Looking at the diorama, Ben felt his hair on the back of his neck stand up. His suitcase dropped from his hand. He was staring into the shimmering lights of the aurora borealis, cascading across the painted night sky. Beneath the blue light of an unseen moon, two wolves were running across a snowy landscape, heading right for Ben. A terrible shiver rippled through him. It was as if someone had cut out the dream from his brain and put it behind glass. Ben read the name of the diorama written in raised gold letters. Wolf, Canis Lupus, Gunflint Lake, Minnesota. And here we have the picture of the guard yelling at the girl, and this is very similar to Ben's story. She can hear him. She is still at the meteorite. She has just put the letter on top of the meteorite, and he's yelling at her. He's got his hand on her shoulder, just like he in Ben's story, and he's pointing for her to get out. You see her face. She's like, oh, she just got caught, right? And he looks angry, so I'd be scared too. So here she goes again, bounding up the stairs. You can see his hand still pointing to get out. And we're back to Ben. Ben felt his knees buckle. He stumbled backward until he was sitting on the floor against the opposite wall. How was this possible? The wolves couldn't be here, but they were. He was staring at them with his own eyes. Someone ran toward Ben and helped him stand up. He was so disoriented that it took him a minute to realize that this was the boy with the curly hair. A family with two little kids stepped around Ben's suitcase, which was still in the middle of the floor. The curly-haired boy ran over to get it, and Ben could see him apologize to the woman. As he returned the suitcase to Ben, his mouth was moving. Ben watched his lips, then he said, "Thank you." He straightened himself up and rubbed his face with his hands. The boy smiled a lopsided grin. He took the green knapsack off his shoulders and unzipped it. He pulled out the museum box and handed it to Ben, who hugged it to his chest. The boy was still talking, and Ben could tell he was supposed to answer a question he had asked, but he had no idea what the question was. Ben interrupted. "Why did you pick this diorama to meet me at?" Then he watched helplessly as the boy answered. Ben stared at his lips and his pointing hands, trying desperately to figure out what he was saying. Before the lightning strike, every now and then he would cover his good ear and try to lip read. He was never able to do it, unless the words were very simple. Ben kept staring at the boy's mouth. He repeated his question. The boy cocked his head and squinted at Ben. His mouth moved some more, and then pointed to the diorama. Ben nodded. With exaggerated slowness, the boy's hand extended forward and pulled the museum box from Ben. He pointed to the engraving of the wolf on the lid, then back to the wolves in the diorama. Of course! The wolves in the box had given the boy the idea to meet him here. An old woman with long white hair walked up to the diorama and stood right next to the boys. She smiled kindly in their direction without really looking at them, then stared into the moonlit diorama. Ben and the boy waited for her to leave, but she just stood there, looking at the wolves and the trees and the curtain of lights in the painted sky. The boy pulled Ben away from the glass to let the old woman have her time with the wolves. He led Ben down the hall to the mountain goat diorama. Ben closed his eyes for a moment and leaned against the wall. When he opened them again, the boy's mouth was moving, and his hand was beside Ben's head, making a snapping motion, just as the nurse had done in the hospital. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a little spiral-bound notebook and a green pen. He wrote something and handed the notebook to Ben, who read the words, "Are you deaf?" Reluctantly, Ben nodded. "No wonder you ignored everything I said." Now, I want you to realize that everything that they're writing is in italics. Remember, it looks different. We've talked about this. This is what he is writing. Ben shrugged. Motioning toward the old woman, the boy wrote, "She's here all the time." Then he pointed to himself and wrote, "Jamie." "I'm Ben." Jamie started making strange shapes with his fingers of his right hand. When Ben didn't respond, Jamie wrote, "Don't you know sign language? I learned the alphabet in school." Ben shook his head. "Why not?" Ben touched his ear. "It's only been a month," he said. "What happened?" Jamie asked. Ben read his lips. "Lightning," he answered. "Lightning?" Ben nodded. "I thought lightning killed you," Jamie wrote. Ben raised his eyebrows as if to say, "Guess not," and Jamie looked as though he understood. Jamie gestured towards Ben's suitcase. "Run away?" Again, Ben nodded. He saw Jamie mouth the word, "Wow." Then Jamie wrote, "From where?" Before Ben could answer, the old woman walked past them out of the hall. The boys returned to the wolves. Ben stared into their shiny glass eyes, mesmerized until Jamie tapped on him on the shoulder and placed his fingers next to the words, "From where?" Ben pointed to the golden letters on the diorama that spelled out Gunflint Lake. Jamie laughed. Ben pointed again, staring hard at Jamie. The boy's eyes went wide. He put his hands on Ben's shoulders and moved him so he was standing with his back to the glass. Then Jamie backed up, lifted his camera, and snapped a picture. Back to Rose, we see her running underneath the birds that was being described earlier in Ben's story. And she's still running. She's like scared and she's got to get out, right? Past the dinosaur museum exhibit. And here's an up close of a T-Rex and his ribs. I am so glad I don't live back in the day when those guys roamed the earth. And the Brontosaurus, and you see her still running. Probably drawing a lot of attention to herself from running because not everybody runs through a museum, right? She looks like she's heard something out of the like next to her. Obviously, she hasn't heard anything, but her face says that she's worried about something, right? Back to Ben. The bright white flash blinded Ben for a second. Remember, Jamie just took his picture in front of the wolf diorama. He shuddered, remembering the lightning. When his eyes adjusted, Jamie was smiling his crooked smile at him, holding the photograph he just snapped, a gray square with a thin white border, which had slid out from the thin slot in front of the camera. Ben knew it would develop by itself in a few minutes, but Jamie shoved it in his pocket before the image was done. "Why'd you do it?" Jamie wrote in his notebook. "Do what?" Jamie mimed running away by moving two of his fingers like little legs. Ben didn't know how to answer. He just knelt down and returned the museum box to his suitcase. Jamie motioned with his hand, and Ben knew it was supposed to follow him. He didn't want to leave the wolves, but he was exhausted and didn't know what else to do. He wished he could just sleep. They walked through long hallways and up staircases until they came to the door that read, "Keep out." Jamie pulled a set of keys from his pocket, shook them happily in front of Ben's face, then quickly opened the door. Ben stared into the dim light on the other side of the door, afraid for a moment to enter. Jamie must have seen Ben hesitate because he took him by the arm and the two boys slipped inside. Dirty plastic tarps covered the windows so the light was dusty and gray. The room was filled with boxes and old books which lined the shelves all the way to the ceiling. Paper spilled out everywhere and water leaked down a wall. A pile of furniture was jumbled together in a far corner. Everything had a thick layer of dust. Ben looked around and said, "What is this place?" Jamie wrote, "My secret room." "No, what was this place?" Jamie shrugged. "Storage?" Ben studied the towering piles of boxes and papers. It reminded him of the moldy archive room at his mom's library with its shelves of ancient, non-circulating newspapers and magazines. Jamie pulled one of the boxes off the shelves and removed a fur blanket. The tag on the back identified it as an object from a caveman display in 1947. He shook it out. With his foot, Jamie cleared away the dust and dirt from the area on the floor toward the back of the room. Beneath the grime was a checkerboard pattern, although most of the paint had faded. Ben was tired, but he was sure he'd seen the pattern before. Maybe it was in the bus station or somewhere else in the museum. Jamie laid the caveman blanket on the ground. He removed a flashlight from another box, handed it to Ben, and the two boys sat down. The blanket smelled a little musty, but it was soft and comfortable. Jamie reached into his knapsack again and pulled out a sandwich. He handed half to Ben, who ate it quickly, even though it was tuna fish, which he didn't like very much. "Thanks," he said between bites. Ben felt a little better after eating, but he was still just wanting to sleep. Maybe he could rest here for a while on the musty fur until his head cleared and he could figure out what to do next. Before he could ask, though, Jamie lifted his right hand and made it into a fist. Then he straightened his fingers and crossed his thumb over the palm. He was repeating the shapes he'd made earlier. Next, he made his hand in the shape of a crescent moon, and then he touched all the fingers to his thumb except his index finger, which he pointed straight up. Jamie motioned for Ben to repeat all the shapes as he mouthed a corresponding letter. Too tired to protest, Ben started copying the motions as Jamie continued. E, F, G, H. Ben liked the feeling of the shapes on his hand, and he woke up a bit. Some letters were easy, like C, L, O, and Z, but they just looked like the written letters, but the others were harder to remember, like P, H, and F. They went through the alphabet a few times, then Jamie reached under a nearby shelf, pulled out a shoe box filled with Polaroids, and slid it toward Ben. Ben understood he wanted him to look at the photographs. He flipped through and saw images of dinosaur skeletons, dozens of views of floating blue whale, and close-ups of bison, lizards, gorillas, mountain goats, elk, coyotes, and the wolves in their dioramas. Another section in the box had photos of museum visitors. There were endless studies of hairstyles, glasses, and clothes. One of the photos was the old woman they'd seen earlier at the wolf diorama. "I told you, she's here all the time. Once I followed her and she walked up to the keep out sign on this room and ran her hand across it. I'd never noticed the door before. My dad works here, so I stole a set of keys from his office and let myself in." Jamie then showed Ben a picture of the woman with the short blonde hair and big gold glasses. He mouthed the words, "My mom." She was standing next to a tree with a swing set nearby. "She works late," Jamie wrote. "I come home on the bus after school. I have my own house key. I spend the afternoon by myself. We live upstate." Ben didn't know what that meant, but it sounded far away. "You don't live in New York City?" he asked. Jamie shook his head and flipped through the photos until he found a picture of a man wearing a crooked bow tie and a hat walking toward the camera. He mouthed the words, "My father." Instinctively, Ben touched the locket beneath his shirt. "He lives here," Jamie wrote. "I see him on the holidays and the weekends, and I live with him during the summer." I'm going to spit. Jamie reached into his pocket and pulled out a picture he'd taken of Ben. He slipped it into the box before pushing it back under the shelf. Jamie pointed to Ben's suitcase and gestured for him to open it. Ben didn't want to, but Jamie's crooked smile convinced him it would be okay. Once he did, Jamie reached for the museum box. It was clear that he wanted to see what was inside. Ben hesitated again, but Jamie urged him to unlock the lock. Everything was in its place. The 2 gray stones, his baby tooth, the little plastic game piece, the fossil, the bird skull, the seashell turtle. Ben picked up each object and told Jamie a little bit about them. Unlike Billy, Jamie didn't tease him. Remember Billy was the kid from school? He seemed to love hearing about them. He asked questions and put out his hand so he could touch all the items himself. Ben watched as Jamie held the objects, and for some reason it made him happy. Only his mom had ever shown so much interest in his collections. When they looked at everything, Jamie zipped up his green knapsack and slung it over his shoulder. He pointed to himself, then toward the door. "It's getting late. I have to go. I'll be back tomorrow," he wrote. "You sleep here. It's safe. Toilets down the hall. Look out for night watchmen." Jamie waved from the door and left. Ben was exhausted and relieved to have a safe place to stay for the night. As he put the museum box back in his suitcase, he thought about Jamie taking such delicate care of the bird skull and the seashell turtle and the stromatolite. He laid down the fur and drew his knees up to his chest, but as soon as his eyes closed, his thoughts turned to home. He was sure the people of the Duluth Children's Hospital had called his family when they found him missing. Were the police going to track him down to New York City? At least Robbie was probably happy to have his room to himself for a while. Ben imagined his mom sitting next to him, lifting his chin so he was looking up into her eyes. He waited for her to tell him what to do, to give him the perfect piece of advice. She always liked him to figure things out for himself, though, and when he imagined her speaking, the only thing she said was, "We're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." Then his mom disappeared, and he couldn't think of anything else to do except go back home. Ben's head buzzed and his skin prickled. He turned on the flashlight and opened the locket. He stared into Daniel's face. Maybe he had been completely wrong from the start. Maybe this wasn't his father at all. Ben had been foolish to come all this way without more information. "Who are you?" he asked the picture. There was no answer. He wished he could stay long enough to find out why the wolves were here, but the guilt over worrying his family expanded his chest, and he knew he had to return to Minnesota. Back to the picture of the girl. She's still running through the museum. This is the, looks like probably the Gems and Minerals exhibit. And then we see her running through, this is the mammoth site. And then there's a huge line of people, and you'll notice the sign says new exhibition. So this would be a, a new, whatever they wanted to display. And so a lot of people wanted to see it. Now she's running. Obviously she's cutting a lot of people. And we're gonna stop here for now. On your Google Classroom, I need you to go work on your part 2 of your Wonderstruck summary. Remember, there's 2 pages, one for the written text and one for the illustrated text. And your theme chart, you can add, well, hold on. Let me pull it up. You can add page 382. This is where Jamie teaches Ben sign language. What is the challenge that Ben faces as Jamie teaches him the sign language? How does Ben respond? What point is the author trying to make?